Have you ever seen a person treated as if they were nothing more than a piece of furniture? A moment where someone, cocooned in the unshakable certainty of their own importance, decides to scrape the dignity off another human being simply because they can? In the heart of Chicago, inside a restaurant named The Pinnacle that sat atop a needle of steel and glass, a young waitress named Clara Sullivan was about to learn the true weight of contempt. The architect of her humiliation was Isabella Vance, the impossibly polished girlfriend of real estate titan Alistair Finch. In front of Alistair's most critical investors, Isabella would unleash a quiet, surgical cruelty designed to leave Clara hollowed out and broken. But Isabella, in her diamond-studded bubble, was making a catastrophic miscalculation. She assumed the young woman in the starched apron was just another face in a lifetime of service staff. She couldn't possibly know that the waitress she was attempting to erase was, in fact, the one person on earth who held the forgotten key to Alistair Finch's entire empire. Because power isn't always announced with a trumpet's call, sometimes it lies dormant for decades, waiting in the silence for the right hand to turn the page. The Pinnacle wasn't merely a place to eat, it was a declaration. Perched on the 95th floor of one of Chicago's tallest towers, its windows offered a god's-eye view of the city, a sprawling circuit board of light and ambition. The air inside was a carefully curated blend of seared Wagyu, vintage Bordeaux, and the low, confident murmur of money talking to money. Here, a handshake could seal a billion-dollar merger, and a raised eyebrow could sink a career. And within this rarefied ecosystem, Clara Sullivan, at 20, was a master of invisibility. It was a skill honed by necessity. She possessed a quiet, observant nature, her movements economical and precise as she navigated the labyrinth of tables. Her uniform, a simple black sheath dress and a crisp white apron, was a cloak of professional anonymity. Her mind, however, was a bustling archive of allergies, anniversaries, and the subtle tells of a diner about to need a refill. She was a ghost who ensured perfection. Tonight, the air was charged with a higher voltage of tension. The prime corner table, the one that felt like the prow of a ship sailing through the stars, was for Alistair Finch. In the brutal world of Chicago real estate, Finch was a prince, heir to the concrete and steel kingdom his father had built. His company, Finch Holdings, was on the cusp of finalizing the Lakeview Ascendant project, a controversial but monumentally profitable development that would reshape a huge swath of the North Side. This dinner was with a delegation of German financiers, the final charm offensive before the contracts were signed. Clara had been personally briefed by the restaurant manager, a perpetually frazzled man named Mr. Dubois. Mr. Finch is a creature of habit, but his companion, Miss Vance, she notices everything, he'd warned, his voice a low hiss. She can find a flaw in a diamond. Do not give her one. Clara knew of Isabella Vance. The society pages painted her as a paragon of style and philanthropic grace, always photographed on Alistair's arm at some gala or charity ball. Her digital footprint was a flawless mosaic of gallery openings, yachting trips, and front-row seats at Fashion Week. She was the city's unofficial royalty. Their arrival caused a subtle shift in the room's gravitational pull. Alistair Finch was tall and severe, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore a Brioni suit that probably cost more than Clara's car, and he moved with the weary authority of a man born to command. Isabella was his brilliant counterpoint. She was a vision in a sapphire silk dress that seemed to pour over her frame. A cascade of diamonds glittered at her throat. Her smile was a dazzling, practiced performance, but it never warmed her eyes. Her gaze swept the room with the cool appraisal of an auctioneer judging livestock. Clara was assigned their table. "Good evening, Mr. Finch, Miss Vance," she said, her voice a model of calm professionalism. "May I begin with some water for the table? We have a wonderful selection of domestic and imported mineral waters." Alistair gave a distracted wave of his hand. "Whatever's cold, and bring the wine list." Isabella, however, did not acknowledge Clara's existence. She was adjusting a stray strand of blonde hair, her attention fixed on her own reflection in the vast window. "We'll be having the Chateau Margaux 96, Isabella stated, not to Clara, but to the air in front of her. And please tell the sommelier to decant it properly this time. The last time we were here, it was practically bruised. Clara maintained her composure, giving a slight nod. An excellent choice, ma'am. The wine was nearly $5,000 a bottle. It was more than 3 months of her rent. The dinner service began, a meticulously choreographed performance. Clara moved with silent grace, refreshing bread baskets, clearing away plates, her presence felt but rarely seen. The German investors were stolid and serious, their conversation with Alistair a dense thicket of zoning permits and return on investment calculations. He was in his element, articulate, persuasive, and utterly dominant. The only jarring element was Isabella. She radiated a profound boredom with the technical talk, often interrupting to recount a tedious story about a polo match or to complain that the orchestra on a lower floor was barely audible. She treated Clara not as a human being, but as a silent, automated extension of the service cart. A curt wave for a fork, a pointed tap on an empty water glass. Clara weathered it all with the practiced resilience of her profession. She had a mental fortress, and the casual condescension of the wealthy usually ricocheted off its walls. But Isabella seemed to have brought a trebuchet. As Clara was presenting the main courses, a delicate operation involving placing heavy plates before each guest simultaneously with a fellow waiter, Isabella chose her moment. "Alistair, darling," she said, her voice clear and caring, slicing through the discussion of steel tariffs. "I was just thinking, isn't it a shame what's become of ambition in this country?" The German investors paused, their forks hovering over their plates. Alistair shot Isabella a look, a micro-expression that was part confusion, part warning. Clara kept her focus, her hands steady, her expression neutral. Isabella, enjoying the sudden spotlight, gestured vaguely in Clara's direction with a diamond-encrusted hand. "I mean, look at this. A young woman, perfectly able-bodied. Instead of striving for something, building a career, creating a life of substance, she chooses this, serving people, carrying plates." She let out a small, tinkling laugh. "It's just so unambitious, so useless, really, in the grand scheme of things." The air at the table grew thick and heavy. One of the investors, Herr Schmidt, set his silverware down with a quiet clink, a clear signal of discomfort. Alistair's jaw was a hard line of granite. This was not on the agenda. Clara finished placing the last plate and straightened up. She met Isabella's cool, dismissive gaze for a single, charged second, then offered a serene, professional smile. "I hope you enjoy your entrees, Miss Vance," she said, her voice perfectly even. "Will there be anything else for the moment?" Her refusal to be drawn, her sheer, unruffled professionalism, seemed to enrage Isabella more than any tearful retort could have. It was a denial of her power to inflict pain. For Isabella Vance to be so calmly and politely ignored by a nobody was the ultimate effrontery. As Clara turned to leave the table, Isabella shifted in her seat. Her designer handbag, a small, jewel-encrusted clutch, was resting on an empty chair beside her. With a small, subtle movement of her elbow, she nudged it off the edge. Time seemed to warp and stretch. Clara, in mid-stride, saw the bag begin its descent. Her reflexes, honed by years of catching falling trays and teetering glasses, kicked in. She pivoted, her body twisting in an attempt to catch the expensive accessory before it hit the floor. Her foot, however, caught on the ornate leg of Isabella's chair. It was a fatal miscalculation. For one heart-stopping, agonizing moment, she was a statue of impending disaster. The tray she was still carrying, laden with a heavy silver water pitcher and a basket of fresh bread, tilted past the point of no return. The crash was not loud, but it was definitive. The silver pitcher landed on the marble floor with a sickening clang, but its contents, a full liter of ice-cold water, erupted upwards and outwards in a spectacular, slow-motion wave. The primary target was not the floor nor the table. It was Alistair Finch. A wave of icy water drenched the front of his immaculate suit, soaking his tie, his shirt, and the sheaf of presentation documents he had foolishly left beside his plate. The restaurant, which had been a sea of gentle murmurs, fell into a profound, echoing silence. Every diner, Every waiter, every busboy turned to stare at the scene of the disaster. For a beat, there was only the sound of water dripping from Alistair Finch's suit jacket onto the pristine floor. Alistair looked down at himself, his face a canvas of disbelief. He saw the ruined suit, the blurred ink on his precious profit projections, and the shocked faces of his German partners. Then his gaze lifted, and he stared at Clara. It was not a look of anger. It was a look of cold, bottomless fury. But before he could speak, Isabella was on her feet, her shriek a shard of glass in the cathedral-like quiet. "You incompetent, clumsy fool!" she screeched, pointing a trembling, perfectly manicured finger at Clara. "Look what you've done. This is a custom Brioni suit. Do you have any idea what that costs? You've ruined everything." Clara stood frozen, blood roaring in her ears. Her mind was a maelstrom of horror and panic. "Mr. Finch, I am so sorry. Her bag was falling. I was trying to catch it." "My bag?" Isabella's laugh was sharp and cruel. "You're blaming my bag for your own oafishness? You probably did it on purpose. You were staring at Alistair all night. You're just some pathetic, jealous girl." The accusation was so venomous, so detached from reality, that it left Clara breathless. Alistair rose to his feet, water dripping from his cuffs. He wasn't looking at Isabella. He was looking at the faces of the German investors, who were now carefully dabbing at their own splashed trousers, their expressions grim and unreadable. His billion-dollar project was drowning in a puddle of ice water. "Isabella, that's enough," he said, his voice a low growl. "Enough?" She whirled on him. "She assaults you. She humiliates me. She destroys this entire evening, and you tell me it's enough? Are you going to defend this useless girl?" She spat the word useless with such venom it seemed to hang in the air. Mr. Dubois, the manager, finally scurried over, his face the color of ash. "Mr. Finch, Miss Vance, my deepest apologies. We will, of course, take care of everything. The dry cleaning, the meal is on the house, naturally." "The house?" Isabella scoffed. "I want her to pay for it. I want her fired, now, and I want her name, because our lawyers will be sending her a bill for that suit." Clara felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, a physical force pressing her into the ground. Her professional facade, the wall she had so carefully maintained for years, was cracking. Tears of pure, hot humiliation burned at the back of her eyes, but she fought them back. She would not give this woman the victory of seeing her cry. "It was an accident," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. "An expensive one," Alistair Finch said, finally speaking directly to her. His voice was devoid of heat, as cold and hard as a glacier. He looked not at a person, but at a problem to be eliminated. He turned to Dubois. "She's fired. Give her details to my assistant. She will be hearing from our legal department." Herr Schmidt, the lead investor, stood up, carefully folding his napkin. He gave a stiff, formal bow. "Mr. Finch," he said, his English thick with a German accent, "it is clear this is not an opportune moment. We will reconsider our position. We shall be in touch." And with that, they turned and walked away. The deal was not just on ice, it was dead and buried. Alistair's face went white. Years of planning, of lobbying, of fighting, all washed away by a pitcher of water and a public spectacle. He fixed his gaze on Clara, a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. As Dubois gestured for her to follow him, to be escorted from the floor like a common criminal, Clara could hear Isabella's voice, a triumphant stiletto heel clicking across the silent room. "You should have learned your place, sweetie," Isabella called after her voice dripping with poison. "Some people are born to own the buildings, and some are born to clean them. You just tried to cross the line." The shame was a physical illness, churning in her stomach. Clara kept her head held high as she walked the long, lonely path to the service exit, but inside she felt herself dissolving. In the glittering, merciless world of Chicago's elite, she had been shown her place with brutal efficiency. None of them, not the triumphant girlfriend, the furious billionaire, or the pitying onlookers, could possibly have known that her real place was one they couldn't even imagine. The L train rattled and groaned its way north, its rhythmic clatter a mocking soundtrack to the chaotic loop of failure playing in Clara's head. Fired, sued, useless. Each word was a fresh turn of the screw. She lived in a small, third-floor apartment in Rogers Park, a universe removed from the Olympian heights of the Pinnacle. Her rent was a constant source of low-grade anxiety. The thought of a lawsuit for a suit that cost more than a year of her salary was so crushing it felt unreal, like a threat from a nightmare. She unlocked the 3 deadbolts on her door and stepped into her sanctuary. The apartment was tiny but meticulously organized, her books arranged by subject, her small collection of historical maps framed on the wall. It was the one place in the world that was wholly hers, but tonight it felt like a cage. She collapsed onto the second-hand sofa, and the iron control she had maintained finally shattered. The tears were not loud or theatrical. They were silent, scalding tracks of rage and helplessness. Rage at Isabella's calculated cruelty, at Alistair's cold, instant condemnation, and at a system that allowed the powerful to swat away the powerless like flies. She was working 2 jobs, the restaurant at night and 20 hours a week in the Special Collections Department of Northwestern University's library. Every spare dollar was funneled into her tuition. She was a history major, a fact that would have seemed laughable and pathetic to someone like Isabella Vance. But for Clara, it was a passion. She loved the tangible connection to the past, the stories hidden in old letters, the secrets buried in corporate archives. It was her escape from the exhausting present. Her only glimmer of hope was the inheritance from her grandfather, Arthur Pendleton, a man she'd never met. He and her grandmother had a bitter divorce before Clara's mother was even born, and he had remained a distant, almost mythical figure. When he passed away 6 months ago, it was a shock to learn he had named her his sole heir. His lawyer, a kind, old-fashioned man named George Hemlock, had explained that the estate was unusually complex and that probate would take a considerable amount of time. Clara had pictured a small, paid-off bungalow in a quiet suburb, maybe a few thousand in savings bonds. It was enough to be a lifeline, a way to finish her degree without the constant fear of eviction. Now that lifeline was about to be severed. A lawsuit from Finch Holdings would devour it whole, leaving her with nothing but debt. Sleep was a battlefield of recurring nightmares. The sound of Isabella's laugh, the coldness in Alistair's eyes, the silent judgment of the entire restaurant. She awoke the next morning to the bleak gray light of a Chicago dawn, feeling as if she'd been physically beaten. Her phone buzzed with an email. The sender was George Hemlock. Miss Sullivan, good morning. I am pleased to inform you that the final transfer of assets from your grandfather's estate has been completed. The matter's of some urgency. Could you please meet me at my office at 11 a.m. today? Clara's heart sank. She typed a quick reply, confirming her attendance. She might as well face the music. She would have to tell Mr. Hemlock that the inheritance, whatever it was already spoken for by Alistair Finch. The offices of Hemlock, Davies, and Strauss were a relic from another time, housed in the historic Rookery building. The lobby was a symphony of burnished brass and intricate ironwork, a world away from the cold glass and steel of Finch Tower. Dressed in her only interview outfit, a simple black blazer and gray slacks, Clara felt as raw and out of place as a stray cat in a palace. George Hemlock greeted her himself. He was in his early 70s with a gentle face, a mane of white hair, and a tweed suit that smelled faintly of old books and pipe tobacco. He possessed an air of quiet decency that immediately put her at ease. "Clara, my dear girl, thank you for coming," he said, his voice a warm baritone, ushering her into an office lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. The window looked out onto LaSalle Street, the heart of Chicago's financial district. "Of course, Mr. Hemlock," she said, her voice small. "I appreciate you seeing me." She decided to get it over with. "Sir, I have to be honest with you. I'm in some trouble. I lost my job last night and, well, there's a possibility I'm going to be sued by a very powerful man." Mr. Hemlock paused, his hand resting on a large mahogany box on his desk. He peered at her over his half-moon spectacles, his expression one of deep sympathy. "I heard about the unfortunate events at the Pinnacle last night. I am truly sorry you were subjected to such boorish behavior." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "However, I can assure you that after today, a frivolous lawsuit from Alistair Finch will be the very least of his concerns. Not yours. He gestured to the leather armchair opposite his desk. Please sit. He settled into his own chair, lacing his fingers together. Clara, I have been your grandfather's legal counsel for nearly 50 years. He was a very private man, a brilliant man. He made me promise to keep the true nature of his life's work under wraps until the estate was fully settled. As of 9 a.m. this morning, all conditions have been met. He slid the mahogany box across the desk. It was unlocked. Your grandfather was not a suburban retiree, Clara. He was a visionary. He was an architect, but he didn't design buildings in the traditional sense. He designed their souls. Clara frowned. My mother said he was a draftsman for a construction company. Hemlock chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. That was his cover, you might say. In the early 1970s, your grandfather, Arthur Pendleton, founded a real estate development firm with a partner, a brilliant but ruthless young man named Marcus Finch. The name struck Clara like a physical blow. Finch. Marcus Finch was Alistair's father, the legendary, feared founder of the empire. Marcus was the deal-maker, the shark, Hemlock continued, watching her reaction intently. Arthur was the conscience. He believed that development had a moral responsibility, to build with beauty, to preserve history, to serve the community, not just the bottom line. They were an unstoppable team for a decade. What happened? Clara whispered. Greed happened, Hemlock said, his voice hardening. Marcus wanted to move faster, build bigger, cut corners. He saw historic buildings not as treasures to be preserved, but as obstacles on a balance sheet. They had a terrible falling out over the Lakeview Ascendant project, the original version from 30 years ago. Arthur refused to sign off on a plan that would have demolished a historic neighborhood. Marcus, using a series of ruthless corporate maneuvers, forced your grandfather out. But, Hemlock leaned forward, tapping the mahogany box, Arthur was smarter than Marcus gave him credit for. He couldn't stop Marcus, but he could plant a seed for the future. He structured his exit in a very peculiar way. He didn't just take a payout, he retained his founder's shares, a 49% stake in what was then called Finch and Pendleton Holdings, and he embedded a clause, a legacy mandate, into the original ironclad corporate charter. He then placed his shares in a blind trust, with instructions that they were to pass to his bloodline and to lie dormant until they were needed. The room began to feel unsteady. The sounds of the city outside faded to a distant hum. Clara, Mr. Hemlock said, his voice gentle but firm, your grandfather left you his entire, undiluted 49% stake in Finch Holdings. As of this morning, you are the single largest shareholder in Alistair Finch's company. Clara's mind simply stopped working. She stared at the box. Shareholder. 49%. It was a string of words without meaning. But that's not possible, she stammered. I served him dinner. He fired me. The irony is not lost on me, Hemlock said grimly. The Finch family has a long and storied history of underestimating the Pendletons. He opened the box. Inside, it wasn't just stock certificates. It was filled with Arthur Pendleton's personal effects, journals bound in worn leather, old architectural sketches, and a heavy vellum document tied with a faded ribbon. The original corporate charter. There is more, the lawyer said. Alistair Finch has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning at 10. He is pushing through a revised version of the same Lakeview Ascendant project that broke his father and your grandfather apart. He needs the board to authorize a massive debt issuance to fund it. As the majority shareholder, your vote is not just symbolic, it is absolute. Without your proxy, the project is dead. Clara's head was spinning. One night she was a waitress, facing ruin at the hands of Alistair Finch. Now she held a financial nuke over his entire legacy. Mr. Hemlock's kind eyes held hers. Your grandfather didn't just leave you stock, Clara. He left you a shield, a sword, and a choice. The question is, what are you going to do? The next 24 hours were a baptism by fire. Clara felt as though she had been flung into a foreign country without a map or a dictionary. Her small Rogers Park apartment, which had felt like a prison cell the night before, now became her command center. The mahogany box sat on her coffee table, an emissary from a past she never knew, radiating a bewildering power. The impulse to flee was overwhelming. She could sell the shares. The number Mr. Hemlock had quoted was so vast it felt like a clerical error. She could vanish, buy a small house, finish her degree, and live 1,000 lives of quiet, anonymous peace. She would never have to see Alistair Finch or Isabella Vance again. But then she thought of her grandfather, Arthur Pendleton. He hadn't just left her money, leaving her the controlling interest, the company charter, the journals. It wasn't a gift, it was a task. It was a baton passed across a 50-year gap. And then she heard Isabella's voice in her mind, dripping with condescension. Some people are born to own the buildings, and some are born to clean them. A new emotion began to crystallize out of the fear, a cold, clear anger as hard as diamond. They had judged her, dismissed her, and defined her by an apron. They were about to learn how to read a book by its cover. She called Mr. Hemlock. "I'm not selling," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm going to the meeting, but I need your help. I don't know anything about corporate governance. I don't know the board members. I don't know the details of this project." A smile was evident in the old lawyer's voice. "I was hoping you would say that. Consider me your counsel. But you, my dear, are the expert we truly need. No one has read your grandfather's journals. No one has touched that charter in half a century. The answers, I suspect, are in that box. I will handle the legal logistics. Your job is to understand your grandfather's legacy." For the rest of the day and deep into the night, Clara didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She immersed herself in the mahogany box. She carefully untied the ribbon on the original charter, the vellum crinkling under her touch. She read the dense, archaic legal language, her skills from the university archives suddenly becoming critically important. She was used to deciphering 19th century handwriting in obscure legal terminology. This was just a more modern version. Then she opened Arthur's journals. The pages were filled with his elegant, architectural script. He wrote of his dreams for Chicago, his belief in civic beauty, his arguments with Marcus Finch. He described Marcus's growing obsession with disruption and legacy, a hunger to build monuments to himself, no matter the human cost. He wrote with heartbreak about the original Lakeview Ascendant project, calling it a soulless monolith designed to erase a community. As she read, Clara realized this wasn't just a business dispute. It was a philosophical war. Late into the night, fueled by black coffee, she found it. Tucked into a pocket at the back of the final journal was a small folded addendum sheet. It was a notarized amendment to the corporate charter, signed by both Arthur Pendleton and Marcus Finch, dated the day of their partnership's dissolution. It referenced Article 4, Section 3, the legacy mandate. She cross-referenced it with the charter. The mandate was vaguely worded, stating that any project requiring the demolition of a designated historic landmark or the displacement of more than 500 residents would require the unanimous consent of the founding partners or their designated heirs. Marcus Finch must have signed it as a meaningless concession to get Arthur out of his hair, never imagining it would ever be invoked. He had likely forgotten it existed within a week, and Alistair, his son, almost certainly had no idea it was there. It was a ghost in the machine, a time bomb waiting for a Pendleton to return. The final piece of preparation was not a stylus, but a trip to her own closet. She chose the black blazer and slacks she had worn to Mr. Hemlock's office. It was her armor. She twisted her long brown hair into a simple, severe bun. She was not trying to be Isabella Vance. She was not trying to be a corporate executive. She was Arthur Pendleton's granddaughter. She was a historian, and she was coming to present her findings. The next morning, in the back of Mr. Hemlock's vintage but immaculate Lincoln Town car, she read the last entry in her grandfather's journal. "I have lost the company. Marcus has won, but I have left a lock on the door. It is a small thing, a forgotten key, but perhaps one day someone of my blood will find it and remember that a city's soul is worth more than its skyline." Clara closed the journal. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was the someone her grandfather had been waiting for. The boardroom of Finch Holdings occupied the entire top floor of Finch Tower. It was a cold, cavernous space of black marble, chrome, and acres of glass that offered a domineering view of the city below. At the center of the room was a massive granite table, polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the faces of the board members like solemn, distorted masks. Alistair Finch stood at the head of the table, a general addressing his troops. He had recovered his composure from the previous night's disaster, encased once more in a flawless suit and an aura of supreme confidence. He was charming the board, a mix of practiced ease and veiled threats, walking them through the final presentation for the Lakeview Ascendant project. And seated in a chair just off to his right, a position of unearned honor, was Isabella Vance. Her presence was a stunning breach of corporate etiquette, but Alistair had insisted. He'd framed it as a chance for the board to meet the woman who would be the face of the luxury condo's marketing campaign. In truth, it was a power play, a signal that she was untouchable. She wore a severe cream-colored business suit, an attempt to look the part of a serious partner. A self-satisfied smirk was fixed on her face as she surveyed the room, a queen in her court. And so, Alistair was saying, his voice resonating with power, with the final financing secured, all that remains is this board's formal authorization. This project will not only redefine the North Side, it will secure the future of Finch Holdings for the next 50 years. He was on the verge of finally achieving the one project his legendary father never could. At precisely 10 minutes past 10, the heavy glass doors at the far end of the boardroom swished open. Alistair stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing in irritation. His executive assistant, a nervous young man named Carter, stood trembling in the doorway. "Mr. Finch, my apologies for the interruption," Carter stammered. "There are visitors. They demand to be seen. They say the meeting cannot continue without them." "I'm not seeing anyone," Alistair snapped. "Get rid of them." "I tried, sir. The man said—" Carter swallowed nervously. "He said his client's appointment was made 50 years ago." Before Alistair could process the bizarre message, George Hemlock stepped past the assistant and into the room. His old-world tweed and quiet dignity were a jarring contrast to the room's aggressive modernism. "Alistair," Mr. Hemlock said, his voice calm but filling the space. "My apologies for the dramatic entrance." Alistair's eyes narrowed. He recognized the old lawyer. "Hemlock, my father's old adversary. What is the meaning of this? If this is about the Pendleton estate, send a letter to our legal team. You are trespassing in a private board meeting." "On the contrary," Hemlock replied, a subtle, sad smile on his lips. "My client's business is the only business this board should be discussing today." He moved to the side and Clara Sullivan walked into the boardroom. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A wave of silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure washed over the room. The board members, a collection of the city's most powerful men and women, stared, their minds fumbling for context. This was not a face they recognized from their exclusive clubs or charity circuits, but two people recognized her immediately. Alistair Finch's confident smirk dissolved as if wiped away by a chemical solvent. His face went blank, then filled with a baffled, rising anger. The waitress. The fired, clumsy waitress from the Pinnacle was standing in his boardroom. It was a violation of the natural order of the universe. A prank. It had to be a prank. Isabella's reaction was far less controlled. The smugness on her face twisted into a mask of pure, venomous disbelief. "You!" she hissed, her voice cutting through the silence. "What in God's name is she doing here? Security! Get this trash out of here!" Clara's eyes met Isabella's across the vast expanse of the granite table. There was no fear in her gaze this time. There was no anger. There was only the quiet, unnerving calm of a librarian who has found the book she was looking for. Her gaze then shifted to Alistair, who was still wrestling with the sheer impossibility of the situation. Mr. Hemlock advanced to the table and placed his worn leather briefcase on its surface. The quiet click of the latches echoed in the silent room. "There will be no need for security," he said, his voice carrying the weight of indisputable law. He pulled out a thick stack of documents and slid a copy in front of Alistair. "Allow me to introduce you all to Clara Sullivan. As of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, pursuant to the terms of the Pendleton Family Trust, the entirety of Arthur Pendleton's holdings in this company have been transferred to his sole living heir." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. Ms. Sullivan is the beneficial owner of 49% of the voting shares of Finch Holdings. She is, by a considerable margin, your new majority shareholder. The only sound in the room was a sharp, strangled gasp from Isabella Vance. One of the older board members, a man named Sterling, fumbled for his reading glasses, his hand trembling as he stared at the document. "Arthur's girl," he breathed, a look of stunned reverence on his face. "My God." Alistair looked as though he had been struck by lightning. 49%. The ghost of his father's partner, a man he dismissed as a weakling and a fool, had just reappeared and seized control of his kingdom, and its vessel was the waitress he had ruined the night before. "This is absurd," Isabella finally shrieked, finding her voice. "She's a servant, a nobody. This is a fraud, a trick." Clara finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear and steady, and it commanded the attention of every person in the room. "I was a waitress, Miss Vance," she said, her eyes locked on Isabella. "It's a profession that requires memory, precision, and the ability to tolerate rudeness with grace. They are skills that seem to be in short supply in this room." She turned her attention to Alistair. "Today, however, my profession is to be the steward of my grandfather's legacy. So I would ask you to remember your place, which is that of a guest in my boardroom." She had taken Isabella's own insult and turned it back on her like a polished mirror. She then walked to the empty chair at the opposite head of the table from Alistair, a seat that had been empty for decades. She did not sit. She placed her hands on its back. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice now crisp and businesslike, "you were presenting the Lakeview Ascendant project. Please continue. I'm very interested to hear your justification for destroying the Northwood Historic District." The power in the room hadn't just shifted, it had been entirely rewritten. Alistair, the king, was suddenly a supplicant. He stammered, trying to regain the momentum. "This is unexpected, but the project stands on its own merits. The financial projections are undeniable. It is the future." He tried to sell, to charm, to command, but the words came out hollow. He was no longer a visionary. He was a man asking permission. "The financials are predicated on a lie, Mr. Finch," Clara said calmly. She pulled a single age-yellow document from a simple folder. It was the addendum from her grandfather's journal. "I spent last night reading the original corporate charter of Finch and Pendleton Holdings. A fascinating document. I was particularly interested in Article 4, Section 3, the legacy mandate." A flicker of confusion crossed Alistair's face. He'd never heard of it. "The mandate, signed by both my grandfather and yours," Clara continued, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell, "states that any project involving the demolition of a Class A historic landmark, which the Northwood Theater is, requires the unanimous consent of the founding partners or their designated heirs." She placed the document on the table. "My grandfather called this project a soulless monolith in his journals. As his designated heir, I am exercising my rights under that mandate. I do not consent." She looked directly at Alistair, her gaze unwavering. "Your project is dead." It was a checkmate delivered with the quiet efficiency of a scholar closing a book. She hadn't just used the power of the shares. She had used the power of knowledge, of history. She had defeated him not with money, but with his own company's forgotten soul. Tiffany could not process the reality of what was happening. Her entire future, the penthouse, the status, the Finch name, was being systematically dismantled by the waitress she had tried to crush. "Alistair, do something!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "You can't let her do this. This isn't about some stupid old building. This is personal. She's getting revenge on us for the restaurant." Clara slowly turned her head and looked at Isabella, a flicker of something almost like pity in her eyes. "Ms. Vance," she said, her voice soft but devastating, "what happened at the restaurant was deeply unpleasant. Your cruelty was memorable in its pettiness. It taught me a great deal about the character of the people my grandfather was forced to contend with." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "But you are gravely mistaken if you think this is about you. A vendetta requires a worthy opponent. You, Ms. Vance, are merely a footnote. This," she said, turning her gaze back to the stun board, is about the legacy of Arthur Pendleton, and that legacy is no longer for sale. Her words hung in the air, undeniable and final. Alistair Finch stared at her, the bravado and anger draining out of him, replaced by a horrifying, dawning understanding. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered, he had been fundamentally misjudged, and he had misjudged in turn, with catastrophic consequences. He slumped into his chair at the head of the table, a king without a kingdom. The Lakeview Ascendant project, his obsession, his legacy, was gone. His authority had evaporated, and it had all been undone by a quiet historian he had dismissed as useless. The aftermath in the boardroom was like the silence after a storm. The board members, grasping the new reality, filed out one by one, offering quiet, nervous congratulations to Clara and avoiding Alistair's gaze. The power had shifted, and they were all rushing to find their footing on the new terrain. Sterling, the old board member who remembered Arthur, stayed behind, his eyes wet with tears as he shook Clara's hand. "Your grandfather would be so proud," he whispered. Alistair remained in his chair, staring at the useless presentation documents, now just a monument to his own hubris. Isabella, realizing the curtain had fallen and she was on the wrong side of it, made one last, frantic play. She hurried to Alistair's side, her voice a desperate, wheedling whisper. "Darling, we'll fight her. We'll get the lawyers to tie this up in court for years. This ridiculous mandate won't stand up. We can still win." Alistair slowly raised his head. He looked at her, but it was as if he was seeing her for the first time, the shrill desperation, the naked, grasping ambition. He saw the source of the poison that had infected his life, the catalyst for the entire, humiliating debacle. She wasn't an asset. She was the embodiment of the very soullessness Arthur Pendleton had fought against. "There is no we, Isabella," he said, his voice utterly flat. He pushed her hand off his shoulder. "Carter will have a car waiting for you downstairs. Your belongings will be sent to you in the morning. I want you out of the penthouse by noon." The blood drained from Isabella's face. "Alistair, you can't be serious. After everything I've done for you?" "Go," he said, his voice final. He turned his chair away from her, a gesture of dismissal more brutal than any shout. Defeated, discarded, and stripped of her borrowed power, Isabella Vance stumbled out of the room, her future in ashes. Only Clara, Mr. Hemlock, and Alistair were left. Alistair finally rose and walked to the vast window, looking down at the city he no longer fully controlled. "He never told me," Alistair said, his voice quiet, speaking more to the glass than to Clara. "My father. He always said Pendleton was weak, that he lost his nerve and ran. He never said he was forced out. He never mentioned any of this." "My grandfather wasn't weak," Clara said, coming to stand a few feet away. "He was principled, and he would rather walk away than build something that harmed the city he loved." Alistair turned to face her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, bewildered expression. "Why you?" he asked, a genuine question. "Why did you stay quiet? Why the waitress job?" "Because until 2 days ago, I was just a history student trying to pay my rent," she replied simply. "I didn't know any of this existed. I was the girl you fired and threatened to ruin over a spilled pitcher of water." A deep, painful flush of shame rose on Alistair's neck. "I am sorry," he said, the words costing him more than any billion-dollar deal. "For that night, for her behavior, for my own. It was dishonorable." "Yes," Clara agreed, offering him no easy comfort. "It was." A long silence hung between them, the ghost of their two grandfathers seeming to fill the space. "So what happens now?" Alistair finally asked, the question of a man surrendering. "Do you fire me? Sell your shares and walk away?" This was her moment of victory. She could banish him, humiliate him as he had allowed her to be humiliated. But looking at the broken man before her, she felt not vengeance, but the immense weight of Arthur's final journal entry. "A city's soul is worth more than its skyline." "No," she said. "You're a brilliant developer, Mr. Finch. You have your father's drive. I'm hoping you also have my grandfather's vision, buried somewhere deep inside. I'm not here to destroy Finch Holdings. I'm here to reclaim its name." She held out her hand. It was not a gesture of friendship, but of a new and binding contract. You will remain as CEO, but you will no longer have unchecked authority. The legacy mandate is back in effect. We will establish a new board committee for ethical development, which Mr. Sterling and I will chair. And our first order of business, she said, her voice firm, will be to design a new Lakeview project, one that incorporates the historic theater, provides affordable housing, and serves the community. One that both our grandfathers could have been proud of. Alistair stared at her outstretched hand, then at her face. He saw no triumph in her eyes, only a serious, unwavering purpose. This wasn't a punishment, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was a new set of rules. It was a chance for a different kind of legacy. Slowly, as if lifting a great weight, he reached out and shook her hand. His was cold and trembling slightly. Hers was steady and warm. I understand, he said. Later that evening, Clara was not in a penthouse suite or at a celebratory dinner. She was back in her small apartment in Rogers Park. The mahogany box was open on her coffee table. The city lights twinkled outside her window, no longer a distant, intimidating spectacle, but a community she now had a duty to protect. She picked up one of her grandfather's old drawing pencils from the box. She had a long road ahead, a world of corporate politics and billion-dollar balance sheets to navigate. It would be difficult and lonely, but for the first time in her life, Clara Sullivan knew with absolute certainty who she was. She wasn't a waitress. She wasn't a nobody. She was a Pendleton, and she had found her place, not serving tables in a glass tower, but at the head of one, ready to build a better world from the foundations up.